that second message, the one that didn't sound like him at all. I'd been turning it over in my mind for days, what it meant, what he was trying to say, whether I was reading too much into 4 words from a man who had never once been careless with anything he said to me. Stefan Calloway didn't send accidental messages, which meant whatever came through that night was deliberate, and I still hadn't decided what to do with that. If you're just finding this channel, welcome. Please subscribe. It genuinely means everything, and it's what keeps these stories going. Drop a like and tell me in the comments where you're listening from today. Now let's get back to Jennifer and Stefan, because part 2 is where everything gets complicated, in the best and hardest way possible. Let's go. The second message had said, "I'm not good at this. I want to be. That's new." I read it probably a dozen times over the following days, each time landing somewhere different in my chest. It wasn't romantic in any conventional sense. It wasn't smooth. It was just true. And somehow that was harder to dismiss than anything polished could have been. I responded the next morning, told him I wasn't particularly good at it either. He sent back a single word, "Good." And then, a minute later, "Friday, there's something I want to show you." Friday turned out to be a small private event at a venue I'd never heard of, a fundraiser for an arts program he supported quietly, without any apparent interest in being seen supporting it. No press, no spotlight, just a room full of people who cared about the same thing. I didn't know that going in. I figured it out about 20 minutes after arriving, when I watched him talk to a 16-year-old kid about photography, with the same focused attention he gave to everything. And something rearranged itself quietly inside me. We moved through the evening easily, the way we'd learned to move through things together. Close, but not performing closeness. Present without making a production of it. At one point, we ended up near the back of the room, while someone spoke at the front, and the space between us narrowed in that gradual way that happens when neither person is consciously deciding to close a distance. His arm was resting on the side of his chair, and my hand was near it, and at some point, the back of my fingers were just resting against his forearm. Neither of us acknowledged it. Neither of us moved away. I was very aware of the warmth of his skin and the steadiness of his breathing, and the fact that I was having genuine difficulty focusing on what the person at the front of the room was saying. On the way out, he asked if I was hungry. I was. We found a late-night place nearby, a diner that had no business being as good as it was at 11 on a Friday, and we sat in a corner booth and ordered too much food and talked until the place was nearly empty. It was somewhere in that booth, under bad lighting with coffee neither of us needed, that the dynamic between us shifted into something I didn't have a clean word for anymore. He said something that made me laugh, really laugh, the kind that catches you off guard. And when I looked back at him, he was watching me with an expression that wasn't hidden at all. It was open, direct, the kind of look that asks a question without using any words. I felt it move through me like something warm and slightly dangerous. I didn't look away. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. And this time, it wasn't brief, and it wasn't accidental, and we both knew it. "Jennifer," he said. Just my name. The way he said it made it sound like a decision. And the part of me that had been so careful for so long felt something it recognized, and for once, didn't immediately pull back from. He drove me home and didn't rush it. That was the thing about Stefan. He never rushed anything, which was both deeply calming and quietly maddening depending on the moment. The city moved past the windows and the music was low, and his hand had found mine again, somewhere on the highway, and just stayed there, easy and certain, like it belonged. I kept my eyes forward and tried to breathe normally. We pulled up outside my building, and he cut the engine, and we sat there for a moment in the particular quiet of a night that isn't ready to end. "Come up," I said. It wasn't planned. It just came out, the way true things sometimes do when you stop managing yourself so carefully. He looked at me, not with surprise, more like he was making sure I meant it. "You sure?" "I've been sure for a while," I said. "I was just being careful." "I know," he said. I was too. My apartment was warm and slightly too lived in, and I was briefly self-conscious about the books stacked on the coffee table and the blanket thrown over the couch. But he moved into the space without any of the awkwardness I'd been bracing for. There's something about the way Stefan occupies a room, any room, that makes ceremony feel unnecessary. I opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving for no particular reason, and we ended up on the couch, close in a way that was different from every other time we'd been close, because this time there was no pretending we were there for any reason other than exactly this. We talked for a while, then we didn't. He set his glass down and turned toward me, and the look on his face was the same one from the diner, open, direct, decided. And I felt the air in the room change, in that way it had been threatening to change for weeks. He reached up and pushed my hair back from my face, slowly, his fingers barely grazing my jaw. And I forgot what I'd been about to say. "Tell me to stop," he said. Quiet, almost a whisper. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. He kissed me like he did everything, without hesitation, without performance, like he'd thought about it and made his decision and was simply following through. And I kissed him back with everything I'd been holding carefully in place for weeks, and it felt like releasing something I hadn't realized was exhausting me to carry. We stayed like that for a long time, the wine forgotten, the city outside doing whatever cities do at midnight, while two people inside are completely elsewhere. At some point, I pulled back just enough to look at him. His eyes were dark, and his breathing wasn't quite steady, and he was looking at me like I was the most interesting problem he'd ever decided he wanted to solve. "I've wanted to do that since the party," he said. "I know," I told him. "So have I." He smiled then, a real one, slow and unguarded. And it was the first time I'd seen him look like that completely, unhidden. And it hit me somewhere deeper than the kissing had, which I was not prepared for at all. He stayed late, not all night, and I appreciated that he didn't assume, that he read the moment correctly, the way he seemed to read most things about me, with an accuracy that was still catching me off guard. We stayed on that couch for hours, close and unhurried, talking in the low, easy way that only happens when the walls are genuinely down. And at some point, my head was against his shoulder, and his hand was moving slowly through my hair, and I was having trouble remembering why I'd been so careful for so long. He left around 2, kissed me at the door, brief, warm, deliberate, and said he'd call tomorrow. He did. That was a Saturday. By Tuesday, something had changed in the texture of our communication. More frequent, less formal, the kind of back and forth that fills the small spaces of a day, without either person planning for it to. A voice note he sent on his way into a meeting that made me smile in the middle of my own desk lunch. A photo I sent him of a restaurant I passed that had a sign so badly designed it seemed personal. Small things. The kind that accumulate quietly into something substantial before you've noticed the weight of them. The following weekend, he asked me to come to his place for the first time. I'd wondered about his space, what it would tell me about him that the restaurants and the overlook and the diner hadn't. The answer was a lot. His apartment was on a high floor with wide windows and the kind of considered simplicity that comes from someone who knows exactly what they want and doesn't fill space for the sake of it. Books. Good ones, red ones, spines creased. A kitchen that had clearly been used. No clutter, but not cold either. Warm in a way I hadn't anticipated, like the man himself once you got past the surface of him. He cooked. That surprised me, though I couldn't have said why. He moved around that kitchen with the same efficiency and ease he brought to everything. And I sat on the counter across from him, and we talked. And I watched his hands while he worked, and thought things I kept mostly to myself. We ate at his table with the city below us and a bottle of wine between us, and the conversation going in that long, unhurried way it always did. And somewhere in the middle of it, I realized I was completely at ease in a way I hadn't been in someone else's space in longer than I could honestly remember. After dinner, we ended up on his couch, and the closeness between us was easier now, familiar in a new way. And when he kissed me this time, there was nothing tentative about it, nothing held back on either side. At some point, he pulled back and looked at me with that steady, dark gaze and said, quietly, "Stay tonight." I looked at him for a moment. Everything in me that was still being careful went very quiet. "Okay," I said, and the way he looked at me when I said it made something in my chest ache in the best possible way. What I didn't know then was that by morning, something would happen that I hadn't seen coming at all. I woke up to light coming through windows I didn't recognize for exactly 2 seconds before I remembered where I was. His bedroom was quiet and warm, and the city outside was doing that early morning thing where it looks cleaned by the night. I lay still for a moment, taking stock of myself the way you do after something significant, checking in, making sure I felt the way I wanted to feel. I did. More than that, I felt settled in a way that was unfamiliar enough to notice. Stefan was already awake. I could hear him in the kitchen, the low sounds of someone moving through a familiar space without hurry. I found one of his shirts on the chair near the bed, left there deliberately, I suspected, in the thoughtful, quiet way he did things, and pulled it on and followed the smell of coffee. He was at the counter, his back to me, and when he heard me come in, he turned and looked at me, in his shirt, in his kitchen, in the early morning light, and something moved across his face that he didn't bother to conceal. "Morning," he said. His voice was lower in the morning. I filed that away without meaning to. We had coffee at his kitchen table with the sun coming in sideways and the city waking up below us, and it was so easy it almost scared me. That's the thing nobody tells you about falling for someone. It's not always the dramatic moments that get you. Sometimes it's the ordinary ones. The coffee, the light, the way he pushed the sugar toward me before I asked. We talked about nothing important for a while, and then he said, without particular preamble, "I don't do this." I looked at him. "Any of this," he said. Not in a long time. I want you to know that this isn't," he paused, choosing carefully, "casual for me." I held that for a moment. "It's not casual for me either," I said. He nodded. Something in his shoulders released slightly, which told me the admission had cost him something, which made me feel closer to him than almost anything else could have. I reached across the table, and he took my hand without hesitation. We stayed like that for a while, the morning moving around us unhurried, and I thought that this was the kind of thing I'd stopped believing I'd find. Not perfect, not without its complications, but real, present, worth the risk of it. I left around noon. He walked me to the door and kissed me in a way that was both goodbye and something else entirely. And I drove home with the windows down despite the cold, because I needed the air to think clearly. I was halfway home when my phone rang. Not Stefan, a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. I did, and the voice on the other end said Stefan's name in a way that made my stomach drop immediately. Not with bad news, with something more complicated than that. With history. The kind that doesn't stay in the past, no matter how much you want it to. The woman on the phone said her name was Claire. She said it the way people say names they assume you already know, with a familiarity that put me immediately on the outside of something. She was polite. That almost made it worse. She said she'd gotten my number from a mutual contact, that she wasn't trying to cause any trouble, that she just thought I should know certain things before I got too far in. I pulled over. I don't remember deciding to. My hands just did it. The car easing to the curb while my brain tried to catch up with what I was hearing. Claire had known Stefan for 6 years. They'd been together for 2 of them, before the accident, before everything changed. She wasn't calling to reclaim him. She was clear about that, almost preemptively clear, which made me think she'd rehearsed this. She was calling because she'd heard about me through the same network of people that apparently connects everyone in this city, whether you want it to or not. And she wanted me to know, she said, that Stefan had ended things with her after the accident, not because the relationship had failed, but because he had decided, unilaterally, without discussion, that she deserved better than what he could give her, that he had pushed her out to protect her, and that he had never, in her experience, stopped doing that to people he actually cared about. I sat with the car idling and the phone in my lap for a long time after she hung up. She hadn't been cruel. She hadn't been territorial. She'd been honest, in a way that felt almost generous, which made it harder to dismiss. I drove the rest of the way home in the kind of silence that has too much in it. I didn't call Stefan that afternoon. I needed to sit with what I'd heard without his voice in my ear rearranging it. I know myself well enough to know that I am susceptible to his particular kind of calm. That he could explain something in that measured, unhurried way, and I would feel the edges of my concerns soften before I'd decided whether they should. So I waited. I thought about the way he'd said, "I don't do this over coffee," that morning. The way his shoulders had dropped when I said it wasn't casual for me either. The way he'd looked at me in that kitchen, like I was something he hadn't expected to want this much. And I thought about Claire's voice, about unilaterally, about protecting people by removing himself before they could decide for themselves whether the risk was worth it. By evening, I had worked myself into a quiet that wasn't peace. It was the specific stillness of someone who has made a decision and isn't sure yet if it's the right one. I texted Stefan, kept it simple, said I needed to talk to him about something, and asked if he had time tomorrow. He responded in under a minute. I can come tonight if you need. I stared at that for a long time. Then I typed back, tomorrow is fine. But even as I sent it, I wasn't sure I believed that. Because something told me that whatever happened in that conversation was going to determine everything that came after it. He came over the next evening with no particular agenda, which told me he already sensed that something had shifted. Stefan doesn't perform casualness. When he's relaxed, he's relaxed. And when he's paying close attention, he doesn't bother pretending otherwise. He was paying close attention. I told him about Claire's call without build-up. Just the facts of it, what she'd said, what I'd understood from it. I watched his face while I talked. He didn't interrupt. He didn't deflect. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the middle distance in that way he does when he's deciding something. And then he looked at me directly and said, "She wasn't wrong." I waited. After the accident, I decided a lot of things for people who hadn't asked me to, he said. I told myself it was consideration. It wasn't. It was control. The only kind I had left at the time. He said it without self-pity and without drama. Just the flat honesty of someone who has spent real time with an uncomfortable truth. "I'm not going to do that with you," he said. "I need you to know that. Not as a promise I'm making, as something I've already decided." I looked at him for a long moment. All the careful distance I'd been maintaining for the past 2 days was still there, but it was thinner now, and I could feel it giving way not because he'd said the right thing, but because it was true, and I could tell the difference. "I'm not looking for perfect," I said. "I know what that costs." "Neither am I," he said. "I'm looking for real." "This is real," I told him. He reached over and took my face in his hands the way he'd done before, but slower this time, more deliberate, and kissed me in a way that felt like punctuation, like the end of one long sentence and the beginning of another. We stayed like that for a while, the apartment quiet around us, the city doing its indifferent thing outside. When I pulled back, I was smiling, and so was he. And it was the uncomplicated kind, the kind that doesn't need anything added to it. We ordered food and stayed in and talked until late. And somewhere in the middle of that ordinary evening, I understood that this was what I'd been circling around for months without knowing how to name it. Not a grand arrival, just two people deciding, without ceremony, that this was worth showing up for. Every day, for as long as it lasted. Which, for the first time in a long time, I genuinely believed might be a while. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to know. Rate it 1 to 10 in the comments. And thank you, honestly, for spending this time with Jennifer and Stefan. It means more than you know.